Welcome everybody to today's free introductory seminar on the Buteyko breathing method. You people have been good enough to get here on time, so I'm starting very close to time. My name is Paul O'Connell, as most of you are probably aware, and I'm a practitioner of the Buteyko breathing method, and I have been now for coming up for 11 and a half years. So the purpose of today, as most of you are probably aware, today is a free introductory seminar about the Buteyko breathing method. So I'm going to give you a lot of information about who the person Buteyko was, the Russian doctor who went on to become Professor of Medicine, talk about how he developed this breathing technique back in the 1950s, talk about the struggles for recognition that he had, talk about how the method was finally endorsed in the Soviet Union back in the 1980s, talk about how it got out of Russia and came to the rest of the world via Australia back in 1990, talk about the research that's been done both with Buteyko's own early work in Russia over a long period of time, and particularly the clinical trials that have been done in the last 10 years here in Australia and also in New Zealand and more recently in the United Kingdom. These boards here have got a few dozen of the hundreds of magazine and newspaper articles there's been on Buteyko in Australia and overseas. Anyone here seen Buteyko featured on television at all? Nobody. Well, you'd be very surprising to know it's been on TV in Australia now over 40 times. Up until the start of last year, these were almost exclusively on asthma and emphysema, but last year we had two specifically on sleep apnea. One was filmed partly here and partly in Box Hill, featuring people I taught who were able to withdraw from CPAP machines. That was on a current affair in March. And then we also had some filming done down in Hobart back in late March, and that was on the ABC Health Science show Second Opinion at the end of August. That was again featuring people coming off CPAP machines. We'll also talk about the science behind the Buteyko method. When you first hear that by changing the way that you breathe, you can get such a profound improvement in your sleep apnea, your snoring, your asthma, your blocked nose, your hay fever, your sinusitis, your rhinitis, your nasal polyps, your anxiety, your panic condition, your chronic fatigue syndrome. When you hear you can improve your sports performance, your ability to do physical work, it's a bit hard at first to accept you'll get all these changes just by altering the way that you breathe. So I'll go fully through the scientific principles of the Buteyko method. I'll also talk to you about my own experience with breathing disorders going back to the 1960s as a 5-year-old being diagnosed with asthma and then gradually going down the pathway of medications, being hospitalised as a teenager a couple of times and trying many different types of health methods to improve my condition with very little success. And then really being lucky enough to see the Buteyko method featured in the media, on TV, back in 1994. Initially being very sceptical, but then going on to do the course, getting great results. Then later on training as a Buteyko practitioner and talk about some of the work that I've been involved with over the years. And whilst today is a free introductory seminar, it is also the first session of a Buteyko course. To actually learn the method for your own health, you attend the course, which is 5 sessions of 90 minutes. So we're going to be here every day until Friday between 4:30 and 6 and also between 7 and 8:30. And I know some of you have already booked in to do the course or you've expressed an interest in doing so, but others of you might have just heard about this recently, haven't heard much about the Buteyko method, so please treat today as a free introductory seminar. And with the practical information that we give you, you will be able to go away and start to make some changes and start to get some improvements within the next 24 hours. Particularly in terms of your quality of sleeping. And I'll give you some specific strategies to improve that before you go today. And then, of course, you have the option to come back tomorrow and register for the rest of the course. But there's no payment, there's no obligation for you at all today. But I will go over those course details again before we finish. So, Buteyko, yes, the name of the Russian doctor who went on to become Professor of Medicine. And it all started back in the 1950s, in fact in 1952, when he was doing the 3rd year of his medical degree. As part of that 3rd year, he was given an assignment to observe people dying. Not a very pleasant assignment. However, he kept noticing without exception that the closer people got to death, the more deeply they were breathing. And this surprised him and fascinated him because he thought, like a lot of people do, that as you get closer to death, your breathing just gradually trails off and then stops. But it doesn't actually work that way. It does increase in depth prior to the onset of death. And after seeing this many times, he started to wonder whether deep breathing was not just associated with dying, but if it was also associated with diseases. Because after all, people die from diseases. So his idea, pretty radical at the time, was to experiment with reducing depth of breathing to see what impact it would have at improving people's illnesses. And very quickly he found that his hunch was correct. People started to get a decrease in symptoms, have an improvement in their sleep pattern, experience less anxiety, have greater energy levels, and as a result they had less requirement for using medications and machines. And the basis of the Buteyko method is that there is a correct and normal way to breathe. And we can measure our breathing like we can measure several other parameters of our body. And I've listed here down the left side of the board some of the very well-known body parameters that would often be measured if you weren't well and you went to see a doctor. Temperature, pulse, blood pressure, blood sugar, the pH of the blood. And if your value wasn't where it should be, you would expect to be given some sort of medication or treatment or advice to correct it. Well, you can also measure your breathing. And the test of significance is the minute volume, how much air you breathe per minute. And just as you'll find all these values in any standard medical textbook, you'll also see that a healthy adult should be breathing in the range of 4 to 5 litres of air per minute. But what Buteyko found with his research over a 50-year period, and what's been backed up in the clinical trials of the method done since 1994, all of this work shows that people with respiratory conditions typically breathe around 14 litres of air per minute, 3 times the standard healthy normal amount. And what Buteyko was saying is that it's this over-breathing which is actually the major cause of our conditions. So what we seek to do by learning the Buteyko method is to introduce you to a series of breathing exercises and techniques, and also some lifestyle changes of great significance but no particular difficulty, all designed to help you get your breathing back to the normal level. And very quickly you'll see these changes and improvements. So to be very clear on that, what we're saying is that the main cause of your snoring, your apnea, your asthma, your nasal problems, your anxiety, your fatigue is over-breathing. Now, when that was first said to me about 12 years ago, when I attended a seminar like this, ironically it's actually 12 years today, it was the 10th of April 1994, I couldn't accept it. I'd had asthma, nasal problems, sleeping difficulties for about 27 years. And someone was telling me that I was breathing too much and that was the cause of the problem. No way, I thought, because I often felt like I couldn't get enough air. And I was often blocked up and having to gasp and try to take more. Well, if you're feeling a little bit like I was back then, the way that I answer that these days is to ask you, when was the last time you woke after an apnea, or you saw someone in that situation? When was the last time you had asthma, or saw someone having it? When was the last time you saw someone having an anxiety attack? When in any of those situations that I've just described, did the breathing pattern look a little bit like mine does right now? We don't tend to have too many problems when we're breathing calmly and gently and easily through our nose. When we have these problems, we tend to be breathing much more deeply and very often breathing through our mouth. At the moment, Western medicine doesn't recognise this over-breathing or hyperventilation until the symptoms have really kicked in. So what we tend to do is focus on trying to identify and get rid of triggers. And then if that doesn't work, we just use symptomatic medications or machines to try to fix the problem. But what Buteyko is saying is that the fact that you're breathing too much in the first place, which is the fundamental cause of the problem. So if we can fix the fundamental cause, we can stop the symptoms occurring and therefore stop the need for taking medications and machines. Now, Buteyko knew right away when he first started to develop the method in the 1950s that it was going to be controversial. Because just a quick look through the available medical literature at the time in the 1950s showed him that there didn't seem to be any other instance on record of people experimenting with reducing depth of breathing. Most people back then involved in breathing research and breathing techniques were getting people to breathe more deeply, and it's still largely true today. So before he did formally announce his findings, he did a significant amount of research. Then when he did present all this information, he had what he thought was such an overwhelming case. He thought his colleagues would embrace his work, change their own practice, implement his ideas, and then nominate him for the Nobel Prize for all this wonderful work that he'd done. Well, it didn't quite work out like that. His colleagues were stunned by the claims that he was making and said to him, look, you must be crazy. How can you be claiming to treat these diseases by something other than drugs or surgery? So initially he was rejected and it was back to the drawing board. What happened in the former Soviet Union is a long, complex story. So I'll just tell it to you quite briefly today. Despite this initial setback, he continued to teach and develop the method. He trained other practitioners in the method. It was being taught widely throughout vast areas of the former Soviet Union throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. Many times there were public outcries. People wanted to know why was the method available in some places, not in others. Why did some doctors refer people to Buteyko practitioners? Why did others not? Anyway, finally, after significant media intervention, clinical trials and public outcry, finally use of the Buteyko method was officially endorsed in the Soviet Union under ministerial order. And there were a further 2 subsequent endorsements of it in Russia in the late 1980s. So the point being, it took over 30 years from the time he made the discovery to the time that the method was officially accepted. And even when it was officially accepted, it was still not being properly implemented into the health system, largely because of the terrible social and economic circumstances at the time. In the mid-80s, with all the political changes that Russia was experiencing, people's concerns were very fundamental. They wanted food to eat and a roof over their head, and they weren't interested in coming out like you on a Monday morning and listening to someone like me talk about changing your breathing pattern. So by 1990, Buteyko was frustrated with this lack of progress in Russia and decided it was time to get the method out to the rest of the world. And fortunately for us, Australia was the first country chosen. That Australia is seen by a lot of people overseas as being a very free, open, democratic type of country, a good place to bring an innovation. And also another reason is that Australia has, along with New Zealand, the highest incidence per capita and the highest death rate per capita for asthma in the world. And we also have an increasing number of people with sleep disorders, specifically snoring and sleep apnea. So they thought it would be a good place to bring the breathing method, get the courses happening, get good results, train other practitioners in the method, have it more widely taught, organise a clinical trial, get something published, and then finally make some changes to the management of respiratory conditions. Well, as we shall learn today, a lot has happened, but there is still quite a long way to go. But it really is worth having an understanding of how the Buteyko method arrived in this country, because it does give us an insight as to why things are the way they are today in Australia with the Buteyko method. So in 1990, a gentleman called Alexander Stalmatsky, known as Sasha, who had worked with Professor Buteyko in Russia for 15 years, arrived in Australia. Based himself in Sydney. Couldn't speak English. So he started teaching the Buteyko method in the Russian community. And within a very short space of time, word was getting around that here was this wonderful new Russian breathing technique. People were going back to their doctors after doing the Buteyko course and saying, look, I'm sleeping through the night, I'm not snoring, I'm not having apnea, I'm not getting asthma, I'm not taking any of these reliever medications. Other people were able to breathe through their nose consistently for the first time in years. And all of this anecdotal success of the Buteyko method meant that the media started to pick up on it. Some of you have had a chance to look at the boards here, which have got a few dozen of the hundreds of magazine and newspaper articles there's been on the Buteyko method over the years. And in the middle of 1992, Channel 9's Current Affair ran a feature on the Buteyko method for the first time on Australian TV. Anyone here seen Buteyko featured on the telly? Well, you may be surprised to know it's actually now been on TV in Australia between 30 and 40 times. And with all of this media exposure and the fact that Sasha had now been here a few years, his English improved, he started introducing practitioner training programs, and towards the end of 1994 it's estimated around 3,000 people had successfully learnt the Buteyko method. And the Australian health authorities started to come under increasing pressure to make some sort of statement about the Buteyko method, because people were ringing them up and saying, look, we keep seeing these stories in the media, does this method really work? Is there a scientific basis to it? Have clinical trials being done? Is it going to be taught through the health department or the asthma foundations? Anyway, finally, after a lot of pressure from the media, the first clinical trial of the Buteyko method outside Russia was conducted here in Australia back in November 1994. And it was done in Brisbane at the Mater Hospital, and it involved 40 people with asthma of approximately similar severity. And the 40 people were randomly split into 2 groups. 20 of them attended a Buteyko course, exactly as we're going to do here over the next few days, 5 sessions of 90 minutes. And the other 20 people formed a control group. This is one of the standard ways that these trials are conducted. You have an active group and a control group, and you measure the results after a period of time. Well, the control group also attended classes of similar duration, 5 sessions of 90 minutes, and they were taught standard conventional health education and asthma management by physiotherapists from the Queensland Asthma Foundation. 12 weeks after the classes had been attended, the results of the 2 groups were compared. And it was found that for the people who'd learnt the Buteyko method after 12 weeks, well, they had an average reduction in the use of their reliever medications of 96%. So most of the people were completely off the relievers. They also had an average reduction in the use of the preventer medication of 49%. And also after 12 weeks, the people who'd done the Buteyko course were experiencing on average 71% less symptoms. And they also reported significant improvements in quality of life parameters. The people in the control group on conventional management, well, after 12 weeks they had no significant change in relievers or preventers, no decrease in their symptoms, and they didn't have any of the sleeping or other quality of life improvements. Well, you'd be quite entitled to be sitting there thinking, well, look what happened back in 1994, how come we don't hear more about this? Well, the results were finally published December 1998 in the Australian Medical Journal, but when the preliminary results were first announced in early 1995, the initial reaction from the Australian medical and scientific community was very, very positive. In fact, the Australian Doctor magazine ran an article under the headline of "Doctors Gasp at Buteyko's Success." But despite all this initial positive support for the method, there was also a feeling in the medical community in Australia that, well, it was only a small trial. It's only the first time we've run a trial of this new method. We really need to do some more research over a longer period of time before we can make any changes to the management of asthma and sleeping conditions. So the call went out for more research. But here we are 10 years down the track, and there's been no other research of similar or greater significance in this country. And the difficulty that we've had in organising research into the Buteyko method is that in Australia, the vast majority of funding for respiratory research comes from the people who make the current system of treatment. And obviously we can't expect pharmaceutical companies to invest money in doing research trials on breathing techniques that might take people off drugs or stop them using machines. And why should they? That's not their business, that's not what they're in the game for. But sadly, none of the other groups involved in health and respiratory management in Australia have been able to come up with any funding of any significance for Buteyko, so the whole issue of research into the Buteyko method in Australia somewhat stagnated. Now, when that was obvious after this first trial by 1995, what then happened was that myself and some of the other people who had not only done the Buteyko course to improve their own health, but who'd also gone on to train as Buteyko practitioners, we formed an organisation called the BIBH. It stands for the Buteyko Institute of Breathing and Health. And we self-funded and conducted 3 other small clinical trials in Australia and New Zealand in the mid to late 1990s. And the results achieved for those were very similar to what I described to you for what happened in Brisbane. But the really good news is that there now has been a major clinical trial of the Buteyko method, a trial that went for a period of 2 years, and a trial that involved a total of 600 people. And that trial occurred in the United Kingdom, in Glasgow. And it's interesting that they were able to get such a big clinical trial happening in Glasgow because the Buteyko method didn't arrive there until 1995, 5 years after it came to Australia. But the clinical trial in the UK has been conducted by this lady, a lady called Jill McGowan. Jill had had asthma all her life, and she did the Buteyko course in Glasgow in 1996. And after 3 days, she found that she no longer needed to take Ventolin. She'd stopped using the nebuliser, and over the next 3 months, she was able to eliminate Pulmicort inhaled steroid, and she no longer had to take courses of prednisolone tablets, which she'd had many times. And obviously, she was delighted with those results. And she was working at the time as a nursing and medical educator at a couple of the universities in Glasgow. And she'd previously been involved in doing asthma research. And she had a diploma in asthma and was one of the first 2 nurse prescribers of asthma medication in the United Kingdom. So needless to say, she thought she was a bit of an expert in terms of asthma management. However, having done the Buteyko course and got great results, she realised that there was a much, much better way to manage it. And what she thought she would do with her research background was to develop a protocol for a clinical trial and run the trial through the NHS, the National Health Service, to prove that the method works so it could be made available for everybody in the UK. But after developing the protocol for the trial and submitting an application for funding to the NHS, she was unsuccessful in the first year at getting any funding. But undeterred, she continued on. And for the next 2 years, she put in applications not just to the National Health Service, but also to several other trusts and funds in the United Kingdom. But the end result of these 3 years of funding applications was absolutely no research money granted. And a similar situation exists in the UK, where respiratory research is largely funded through the pharmaceutical industry. However, Jill McGowan was so determined to go ahead and conduct the clinical trial that she sold her house to fund the initial stages of the trial. And myself and one of the other Australian practitioners, we spent a total of 5 months in the UK in 2001 and 2 teaching the people on the trial on a voluntary basis. So that's how they were able to get such a big clinical trial happening in the United Kingdom. The results of that clinical trial, very similar to what I described to you for what happened in Brisbane, but the main difference was the reduction in the preventer medications was much higher. It was over 90%, whereas the Australian trial was only 49%. And the reason why it was so much higher in the Glasgow trial is because that was over a 2-year period rather than a 3-month period, and it takes time for the healing of the inflammation of the airways to occur. Jill presented the results of the trial to the British Thoracic Society at their winter conference on the 4th of December last year, and an abstract of those results was published in the Thorax Journal of Respiratory Medicine on the same date. And many good things have happened as a result of the trial. One is that Jill was nominated for and received a couple of major awards in the UK. The second one, the bigger one, being called the Pride of Britain Carer of the Year Award. And she was presented with that in March 2002, and that was telecast nationally in the UK. And the profile of the Buteyko method increased significantly as a result of that. Also around that time, the wife of the film actor, Ewan McGregor, Ev McGregor, did the Buteyko course, got off her asthma drugs, greatly improved her sleeping, and it's really helped having a high-profile person like Ewan McGregor supporting the Buteyko method. And this headline here, Glasgow nurse to treat Twin Towers rescue workers. Well, what happened there was that at the awards ceremony for the Pride of Britain in March 2002 were some of the police and fire chiefs who'd been involved in the September 11 disaster in New York the year before. They were there both presenting and accepting special bravery awards. And when they saw the work that Jill had done and the video testimonials of people who'd learnt the Buteyko method, they realised that there would be an enormous application for it in New York. You can imagine the terrible air quality as a result of the disaster. And they invited her to go to New York to conduct some Buteyko courses for the services personnel. And naturally she accepted. And it was initially supposed to be organised and funded through the British and American consulates. But unfortunately the red tape got in the way and the funding wasn't available and it looked like it wasn't going to go ahead. But luckily, when I was in the UK in September 2002 working on the clinical trial, Jill managed to make contact with one of the fire brigades in Glasgow, Strathclyde Fire Brigade, and she and I subsequently taught the Buteyko course to a shift of firefighters and several of their relatives who had sleeping disorders and asthma. Well, the results for the sleeping disorders and asthma were as good as they always are, but what the firefighters were noticing was that within 2 weeks of completing the Buteyko course, their breathing apparatus was lasting up to 3 times as long. And they also had significantly less inhalation of smoke and toxic fumes, and they found that their ability to recover after the strenuous activity of fighting fires was greatly enhanced. So after experiencing those results and being aware that Jill had been hoping to do the New York visit but didn't have the funding for it, they then decided to get into fundraising mode, and luckily they had a bit of experience at this, and they were able to raise enough money not just to send Jill to New York, but they were I also got invited on behalf of our institute, and 17 of the Glasgow firefighters came over with us as well. The role of the firefighters was to explain to their colleagues in New York the benefits of learning Buteyko. It's one thing for you people to come along here today for an hour and a half, go away and try what we say, and then have an understanding as to how this can help your sleep disorders, your asthma, your nasal problems and so on. But to quickly explain to a seemingly fit and healthy firefighter that they should spend 5 sessions of 90 minutes over 5 days retraining their breathing and not only improve their health but also their work performance is not an easy thing to do. So because the Glasgow firefighters had been through that process, that was their role in New York. It got a lot of publicity in the UK because it was a locally initiated endeavour, and it did get a bit of publicity too here in Australia, including a segment on Channel 9 News. Jill McGowan went back in May last year and put about 40 or 50 of the firefighters through the course, and they did get great results. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my own experience with breathing disorders before we then go on and talk specifically about the science of the method and how it can help certain conditions. Yes, I was diagnosed with asthma as a 5-year-old back in the 1960s. Some of you remember those days, and if you do, you'll be aware that these medications for asthma didn't really come out until the late 60s. So I didn't actually go on to Ventolin until I was about 10 years of age. And like a lot of people who take Ventolin, when I first took it, I just thought it was fantastic. Because I'd just take one puff of this drug and all of a sudden that wheezing, that tightness, that heavy-chested feeling would just go away and everything would open up and finally I could get some relief. But the problem I had, and the problem that so many people do have, is that initially one puff will get you through, but then you start to need 2 or 3 or even 4 to get the same effect. Shortly after that I went on to Becotide, one of the early inhaled steroid medications. 2 years later I was put onto Intel. These days you get Intel through a puffer, but back then it was through a device called a spinhaler that some of you may remember from the 1970s. And then at 15 I had 2 very severe attacks which put me in the Austin Hospital in Melbourne. I should have said I was from Melbourne. And when I came out of hospital the first time, my family were told very sternly by the doctor that they had to go and buy a nebuliser for me. And I started using that with both Ventolin and Atrovent. Then I was given courses of prednisolone tablets and I started having side effects as a result of those. So within a very short space of time, it was a lot of asthma and it was a lot of medication, and it was very rare for me to sleep through a night without waking 2 to 3 times. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you people that breathing and sleeping disorders really do affect your quality of life. It certainly stopped me playing sport to the level that I thought I was capable of. And it also tends to take your confidence away when you always have to carry medication with you. I used to worry about catching a cold because that would become a chest infection, everything would get worse. And even going away became an ordeal because the family would have to take the nebuliser, the spacer and all the medication. And as I got a little bit older, particularly throughout my 20s, I looked for other ways to try to help to improve my health. And you may well have tried some of the things that I did. Physiotherapy, breathing, chiropractic, acupuncture, homeopathy, naturopathy, diet changes. But it didn't matter what I tried, it still had the asthma, still had the sleeping problems and still needed the drugs on a daily basis. And it was really by pure chance that I was fortunate enough to see one of the early current affairs segments on Buteyko. The situation was we were on holidays in Adelaide at the time, and you might have had this experience where you check into a hotel or motel room and the first thing you do is turn the TV on, just because it happens to be there. And straight away there it was in front of me, breakthrough method for breathing disorders. So naturally I watched it. And what I saw was a group of people being interviewed straight after a Buteyko course, making what I thought at the time were extraordinary claims about their rate of improvement. And I can't say I believed everything that was being said, but I was at least interested enough to try to find out a bit more. So I quickly made a note of the name. And as I was saying to a few of you at the start, I think that's one of the reasons why it's been hard to get information out there about Buteyko. It's a difficult word to remember, to spell, to pronounce. A lot of people think it's Japanese when they see or hear it for the first time. And you'd be amazed how many people have said to me, what's this potato method that you speak of? But anyway, I eventually tracked down an organisation by this name in Sydney, rang them up and found out that Sasha, the Russian practitioner, was coming down to Melbourne about 6 weeks later to run one of the early Melbourne courses. But before I would agree to do the course, I wanted to know what was the scientific basis of it, because I'm a scientist originally by profession and a fairly sceptical person. And they explained to me on the phone that it was based on what's called the Bohr effect, which I'll go through with you shortly. So I went along to the course, April 1994, and at that stage I was taking an average of 15 puffs of Ventolin per day, and usually waking 2 to 3 times throughout the night. Anyway, after 3 days of the Buteyko course, I went 24 hours without Ventolin, and on the 4th night of the course, I slept right through without disturbance. So here I was getting results like the people that I'd seen on TV, but not without effort. Changing your breathing certainly requires a level of effort and commitment. And that's one of the reasons why we like to open up these first sessions of the course, explain all these things to you, and most importantly, give you some challenges over the next 24 hours. Changing your breathing certainly requires a level of effort and commitment. And that's one of the reasons why we like to open up these first sessions of the course, explain all these things to you, and most importantly, give you some challenges over the next 24 hours. And the number one challenge that I have for you all in the next 24 hours is to breathe through your nose. So have your mouth closed and breathe through your nose. Now most of you are sitting there with your mouth closed, breathing through your nose, and you might think this is easy. You're allowed to eat and drink and speak, by the way. But we find not many people are up to this challenge, and amazingly probably half fail before they get out of their chair to lead one of these seminars. Because a lot of us, as soon as we have to move, as soon as we have to exert ourselves, We find it more comfortable having our mouth open, or we find it very difficult to keep it closed. Now that I've said this, you'll all stand up later on with you walk out the door. But what happens when you hit the front door and there's a breeze and there's a change of temperature? For a lot of us, our breathing will change without us even really being aware. So just observe yourself over the next 24 hours. What happens when you bend down and pick something off the ground? Can you keep your mouth closed and breathe through your nose? See what happens next time you clean your teeth. Can you keep breathing only through your nose? Try having a shower and washing your hair without opening your mouth. Most people find that impossible when they first try it. And watch what happens when you eat. Are you one of these people who tends to take air and food every time you take food? Or can you easily close your mouth and nasal breathe as you chew and swallow your food? And what happens when you speak? People well trained in the Buteyko method are easily able to rebreathe through the nose when they need to take air rather than gasping it in through the mouth. And probably the most important thing to observe in yourself in the course of the next 24 hours is what happens when you go to sleep. If you ever, during the night or in the morning, are getting a dry mouth, if you're needing to drink water, if you're waking up feeling tired in the morning despite the fact you've been in bed for a long time, if you're a restless sleeper, if you've got restless leg syndrome, if you're cramping, if you've got poor circulation, if you get pins and needles, if you're regularly getting up to go to the toilet during the night, if you're snoring, if you're having any apnea when you stop breathing, if you're getting asthma, if you're chronically coughing, if you're getting a blocked nose, if you've got any phlegm in your chest, your nose, your throat, some people can relate to this obviously, then that indicates that you'll get great benefit from correcting your breathing with the Buteyko method. In fact, improvements in quality of sleep are usually the first things that people notice. And before you go tonight, I'm going to give you 3 specific strategies so you can start to improve your sleep over the next couple of nights. So yeah, I did well in the Buteyko course. I found it hard at times, but I persisted. I was lucky to learn with a very big group because it was hot on the heels after a couple of these current affairs shows. And I kept in contact with a couple of people I'd been through the course with just to see how they were progressing as the weeks went by. And like me, they were only continuing to improve. Then I started to think, well, I wonder what the more long-term effects of Buteyko are like. And through a work colleague at the time, I was able to get a hold of some of the original current affairs segments when the method was first featured in Sydney back in 1992. So I subsequently spoke to some people who learnt the method over 2 years previously. And these people were sleeping through the night, off their drugs, feeling better, not getting symptoms, and like me, just could not understand why there wasn't more information around about Buteyko. Then I thought, well, I wonder what the Australian health authorities think about this. Back then in 1994, it was said that the incidence of asthma in school-age children had doubled in the previous 10 years, despite all this money being spent on medications and research. And also the rising condition, which is much more well known than it was then, sleep apnea, where people were suddenly being required to either go and have an operation to cut out part of their soft palate or to go onto the CPAP, continuous positive air pressure machines. So I started off by ringing the health department, and I found out that they knew absolutely nothing about the Buteyko method at all. Then I contacted and subsequently went and saw the Victorian Asthma Foundation and the National Asthma Campaign. And I'm really glad that I did go and meet with those organisations because it gave me an insight that would take a long time before there were going to be any formal changes to the management of respiratory and sleeping conditions. Why? Well, it all comes back to the way that the Buteyko method was introduced into this country. Normally when there is an innovation in something like respiratory or sleeping problems, the information goes from the top down. That would be from the Thoracic Society to the specialists, the hospitals, the GPs and nurses and out to the public. But as I've explained today, the Buteyko method has very much taken a different path, very much come from the bottom up. Particularly in the early days, very much the media and the people who learnt the method who tended to move it ahead. It's really only in more recent times with the publication of results of clinical trials and some of the other work of the Buteyko Institute that more has been known about the method. So what they said to me at these organisations was, oh yes, we've heard about Buteyko, we know it's been in the papers, and every time it's on TV people ring us up and ask us about it, but we can't really say much because we haven't got much information. And I explained to them about my own improvement. I told them I'd gone through this course with about 35 other people with a range of conditions, all getting good results. But it didn't seem to matter what I was saying, I didn't really feel like I was getting very far. So I said, well look, what's the problem? This is really a great opportunity to improve people's health. And here the Asthma Foundation said, well there's really 2 problems. Firstly, there's nothing published on Buteyko in the Western medical literature. And secondly, there's no formal organisation representing the method. Now this is back in 1994, those things are well and truly happened now of course, but I explained to them then that it was impossible because this has been locked up under communism for 40 odd years. But I still didn't really seem to be getting anywhere, so eventually I said, well, what do we do to try to take this thing forward? And the response from the head of the Asthma Foundation was, well, if you're really serious about this, you need to go and talk to the Federal Health Minister. And at the end of that meeting, his response to her was, well, if you're really serious about this, you need to go and talk to the head of the Asthma Foundation. And that was when we realised we were going to go round and round in circles. That was when we made the decision to form the Buteyko Institute of Breathing and Health. We started as a group of 10 people in the mid-90s in Australia and New Zealand. We've now got over 100 members in 14 countries around the world. Well, after my experiences with these organisations, I spent a bit more time thinking about the whole issue of Buteyko and wrote quite a few letters to other health organisations, parliamentarians, people in the media. But if any of you have any experience in social improvement initiatives, you're probably aware that you tend to send a lot of letters off, but not many come back your way. So after that, I made the decision to apply to do the Buteyko Practitioner Training course. And I did that over the last several months of 1994. So I'm now into my 12th year teaching the method. In that time, I've now taught over 4,000 people, probably about 2/3 of those throughout Victoria, and increasingly in recent years, the work overseas I've mentioned in the UK, the US and Cuba, and also quite a lot interstate in the last couple of years. And what I've consistently seen in that time is what we typically see in Buteyko courses. For people who do the course for respiratory conditions like asthma, over 90% of people come off all of their reliever medications within a week of starting, even people who've been long-term Ventolin nebuliser users. And in the last probably 2 to 3 years, we've seen a significant increase in the number of people doing the Buteyko course for snoring and sleep apnea. And we've been able to help numerous people avoid having operations for obstructive sleep apnea and also avoid going on CPAP machines for sleep apnea. And for people who are already on CPAP machines, there's a very good chance you'll be able to withdraw from the machine once you've corrected your breathing with Buteyko. But we can't just throw the machine away. What we have to do is improve you to a certain extent and then have periods of observed sleep without the machine, noting the reduction in the frequency and duration of the apneas, and then increase that time as things continue to improve. And what I'll do is I'll explain a bit later on the theory of the Buteyko method and how it does apply to sleep apnea. And for those of you who are interested, I've also got copies of an article that was in the Australian Nursing Journal about the application of Buteyko to sleep apnea, which has got, well, that's where this diagram actually comes from, and it's also got some case studies in there. And that article was written by Mary Birch. Mary's a registered nurse who trained with me as a Buteyko practitioner about 6 years ago. So yeah, that's how I got involved with it all and a bit of what's happened over the last few years. Well, let's talk about what happens when we breathe and how we can get these improvements by altering our breathing pattern. Well, that's the composition of the air that we breathe. It's mainly nitrogen. About 78% of the air is nitrogen. Nitrogen is fairly inert, which means it doesn't react with a lot of things. 21% of the air is oxygen. As you probably know, oxygen is the gas that we need for the growth and regeneration of all our body cells and tissues. But the gas I really want to talk about is CO2 or carbon dioxide. Hardly present in the air at all, in fact only 0.03%. But in our lungs, or more specifically in our alveoli, the tiny little air sacs at the end of our lungs, we must have somewhere between 3 and 6.5% carbon dioxide. If the carbon dioxide level is low, it has a very negative impact on our health. Whereas the higher the level of carbon dioxide in the lungs, the better it is for our health. And the main reason for that is because of the way that the gas oxygen gets transported around in the blood. You may have heard of haemoglobin, symbolises Hb, the protein molecule in the red blood cells. Oxygen gets bonded to the haemoglobin and the whole molecule is called oxyhemoglobin. And you've literally got millions of these oxyhemoglobin molecules attached to your red blood cells. Now, it's great having oxygen stuck in your blood, but what you need to happen, of course, is to break the bond and get the oxygen released so it goes to your brain and goes to all the cells and tissues of your body. The key to breaking the bond and releasing the oxygen is to get your carbon dioxide level up towards the high end of the range. Well, let's think about that. If there's hardly any carbon dioxide in the air, but we've got more in our lungs, and that tells us that we produce it internally. And you're probably aware of that because you hear people say, oh yes, we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. It's a waste gas. We breathe out some of it, but we don't breathe out all of it. And we have to leave at least 3% in our lungs to stay alive, and the more we retain, the better. So if we want to retain a higher amount, and we're producing it internally, then we don't want to lose it. And the way that we lose it is by blowing it off by breathing too deeply. either breathing through our mouth or breathing too deeply through our nose. So if we can retrain ourselves to breathe back at the normal level, we'll retain more carbon dioxide in the lungs, and that results in a much greater release of oxygen to our cells and tissues. This relationship between the CO2 in the lungs and the oxygen release from the blood is what's known as the Bohr effect. Some of you might know the name Bohr from scientific circles. Niels Bohr was a very famous atomic physicist. This is his father, Christian Bohr, Danish professor of physiology, who was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1907 for his work in discovering this effect. So this is not new. It's been known for nearly a century. But what is new, what Buteyko has worked out, is that you can change the way that you breathe. You can reset the level of carbon dioxide, which triggers the breathing mechanism in your brain. So what does all this mean? Well, if I try to take away all of this scientific jargon and just to give it to you in very plain, simple words, what I'm really trying to say to you is that in order to get more oxygen, what you need to do is to breathe less. I'm getting some blank looks around the room. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Breathe less and get more oxygen. Well, let me explain it to you another way. How many of you people have ever yourself hyperventilated or seen someone hyperventilate, where someone is breathing heavily and deeply for a prolonged period? How do you start to feel if you do that? What sort of symptoms do you get? Yeah, you get dizzy, you get lightheaded, you get anxious, you get agitated. And if you don't stop and you keep on hyperventilating, you'll get very tired. You start to lose the feeling in your fingers and toes, and eventually you'll collapse, you'll faint. So the reason we go dizzy, of course, is because we're getting a lack of oxygen to our brain. So the reason we use this example is to make us think, does deep breathing give us more oxygen? The answer is no, it actually gives us less. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the very old-fashioned but quite effective remedy for people who are hyperventilating to stop them going dizzy and fainting. Who can tell me what it is? Yeah, rebreathe your own air from a brown paper bag or similar device. And the reason it works, of course, is because of the Bohr effect. Because the air that you're hyperventilating out has got all this carbon dioxide. And if you can take some of it back in, the level rises again in the lungs and the oxygen gets released from your blood and goes to your brain and other cells and tissues and stops you going dizzy and fainting. So when we explain it like that, it makes a little bit more sense. But when you first say, breathe less and get more oxygen, it does sound strange, but that is actually the case. Now sure, if you keep breathing deeply and heavily through your mouth, you're taking in large amounts of air, large amounts of oxygen, but you're not getting the correct transfer, air to lungs, lungs to blood, blood to cells and tissues of your body. The key to getting that transfer happening is to breathe at the rate appropriate for your activity. And at the moment you people are at rest, your activity is minimal, and that is all the air that your body requires, 4 to 5 litres per minute. But we're not against deep breathing per se, we're just saying breathing should be relative to your activity. So the time to breathe more deeply, me standing up here speaking and moving around, you walking outside to your car, doing some physical exercise, going for a run, going for a swim, riding a bike, if you're dancing, if you're singing, all these sorts of things. But at rest, that's all the breathing that your body requires, and technically anything above that is over-breathing or hyperventilation. Now, we're challenging you to breathe through your nose for the next 24 hours. Some of you might find that a little bit difficult because your nose tends to get blocked at times. Anyone here tend to suffer from a blocked nose at any time throughout the day? Okay, now I'm very hopeful that in a crowd this size, we're going to have someone who's got a blocked nose or a partly blocked nose at the moment. Can you just put your hand up if you've got a blocked nose or a partly blocked nose at the moment? Oh no. There's nothing worse than doing one of these seminars. One. I'm sure there's others here. Oh, fantastic. Last seminar we had more people here, but we hardly had anyone with a blocked nose. Because we want to show you how to unblock your nose. And there's nothing worse than getting you to do this and no one's got a blocked nose, because you won't know whether I'm making it up or whether it really works. So I can see Joanna's got to her feet because she's going to very kindly demonstrate this exercise while I talk her through it. I will just warn you though, it looks rather stupid. So you might want to start laughing at her, but I'm sure she can handle it. But there is method to the madness, and I'll explain exactly why we do what we do after she's done it. So I'll just get you to watch at this stage and I'll talk you through it a little bit later on. What I'd like you to do, please, Joanna, is to have your mouth closed, and then to breathe in through your nose, then out through your nose, then to hold your breath and hold your nose, and then to start nodding your head up and down. Looks a bit strange, so you might want to laugh at her, but I'm sure she can handle it. At the moment, she's comfortable and she doesn't have to breathe. But fairly soon, she wants to breathe, but I don't want her to. I want her to keep holding and holding and holding as long as she can. And when she finally has to breathe, that's okay, but she's got to keep her mouth closed. So I want her to put her finger on her lips to force her to breathe through her nose. What you will find after doing that is that if you had any mucus in your nose, it tends to shift and clear and get reabsorbed. And your nasal passages and your sinuses will begin to open. But if you happen to open your mouth at the end, your nose is likely to block up more than what it was previously. The reason we hold our breath with this exercise is that when you hold your breath, you stop your external respiration, which means there's no exchange of gases between the air and the lungs. But your internal respiration continues. And one of the things that is produced, of course, is carbon dioxide. So because you're holding your breath and you're producing carbon dioxide, the level is rising, which is what we need to do. And the reason for the movement is to increase the blood flow to the affected area. So let's all give it a try. And I'd like all of you to do it. And the reason is that if your nose gets blocked in the next 24 hours, you're going to need to know how to do this, so it's a good idea to have a practice. And also because several of you will probably find things are a bit clearer after you do this when you didn't really think there was a problem before. So we all just start with our mouth closed, and we breathe in through our nose, breathe out through our nose, hold our breath, hold our nose on the out breath, and then just start gently nodding our head up and down. At the moment, it feels easy, easy, easy. We're quite comfortable. Fairly soon, some of you are probably going to want to breathe. We'll try to go a bit longer. Really try and force yourself. But when you do have to breathe, finger on your lips. That's the most important thing. Stop yourself from breathing through the mouth. Finger on your lips and force yourself to breathe through your nose. And we shall see what happens. A couple of people still going. Just make sure that mouth stays closed at the end. Okay, just by a show of hands, how many people feel that things are a bit clearer after doing that exercise? Okay, many. That's good. Oh, very good. Quite a few. Okay, thanks, Joanna. Now, I have a very challenging question for you all. Why does our nose get blocked? I'll give you a clue based on what I've been saying today.
Because we've been opening our mouth and holding our nose.
The main reason our nose blocks is because we breathe too deeply, and the most likely reason for that is because we're breathing through our mouth. Because when we breathe too deeply, and just look at the size of your mouth compared to the size of your nostrils, give you an idea of how much more deeply you breathe. When you breathe more deeply, as we've explained, you start to lose carbon dioxide. Now, your body is a very smart system. It always tries to self-correct. So what it does is it produces mucus to restrict the space you can breathe through, stop you breathing more deeply and losing the carbon dioxide. But the problem is we feel this constriction, this blockage, so naturally we sniff or we blow our nose or we cheat and bypass it and breathe through our mouth. None of those things correct our breathing, they all make it deeper. And that's the reason why after you've blown your nose, quite often a few minutes later you find it's blocked and you've got to do it again. I know it does sound very simplistic, but the main reason the nose blocks is because we overbreathe, and the most likely reason for that is we're doing too much breathing through the mouth. About 3 years ago I did a seminar just like this, and a lady came on behalf of her 6-year-old son who had very severe asthma. And I came back the next day and registered for the course, and when she was doing that she said to me, "Oh, you'd never believe what happened last night." I said, "Well, what happened?" And she said, "I've got another boy who's 10. She said, "He doesn't get asthma, but at the age of 10 he'd already been diagnosed with sleep apnea, and he'd had 2 operations to unblock his sinuses and his nose. And both times within about 6 weeks he was totally blocked up again. And they initially thought that there was the carpets in their house, so they ripped them up and put down polished floorboards. Made no difference, he still had his problems. Then they thought it was something else in the house or the garden, so they sold up and moved to another place. Made no difference. Then they took him to numerous doctors and specialists. He was on a special diet, he was taking supplements. Anyway, I knew exactly what she was going to say. They had to go home after the seminar and do this exercise 4 times, but they got the boy's nose unblocked. She was happy and sad because she estimated she and her husband had spent between $70,000 and $100,000 trying to unblock his nose. 5 minutes of Buteyko and it was unblocked. So yes, it only takes us about 5 minutes to show you how to unblock your nose, but it takes us 5 days to show you how to change your breathing to stop your nose from blocking, and to show you how to change your breathing to stop your snoring and apnea, and to show you how to change your breathing to stop your asthma. So if you see people walking along Green Hill Road doing this, you'll know that they were able to come to a seminar, but they didn't actually do the Buteyko course. Now, believe it or not, the process by which we have asthma and the process by which we get sleep disorders are very, very similar to the process that I just described with a blocked nose. Firstly, let's just talk about asthma. Asthma is often triggered by something, and a lot of people are aware of the common triggers. It's the dust, it's the pollen, it's the pollution, it's the food, it's the smoke, it's the dogs, it's the cats. But yes, these things are just triggers, they're not the fundamental cause. And what the triggers do is put our system under stress. That causes an increase in our heart rate, and that makes us breathe more deeply. And as we've explained, when we breathe more deeply, we start to lose carbon dioxide. And if you're genetically predisposed to asthma, your body tries to self-correct by closing your airways to stop further hyperventilation and loss of carbon dioxide. But the problem is the person experiences this tightness, this inability to breathe, so naturally we try to breathe against it. But the more we breathe against it, the more deeply we breathe and the more we lose the carbon dioxide and the tighter the asthmatic response becomes. Then we get to the stage when we're really struggling and we start heaving air in through our mouth. And as a lot of people would know, once you start breathing like that when you've got asthma, you're very, very close to needing a puff of Ventolin or Bricanol. So you take a puff, you might need a couple, but generally the drugs work pretty well. They give you great relief. But how do they really work? Well, these reliever medications, or bronchodilators as they're known, they're based on adrenaline. And they open your airways, which is essential, and of course that can save your life, and did with me a few times. But what does adrenaline do? Adrenaline increases our heart rate, and that makes us breathe more deeply. Then we get confronted with a not very pleasant possibility that maybe the very drugs which give us relief are actually responsible for making the condition worse and bringing it back. This was highly suspected in the medical profession within about 10 years of these reliever drugs coming onto the market. And in order to test whether that was truly the case, clinical trials were conducted, and the most famous of them were done in Canada and New Zealand. And the conclusion of the trials was that as little as 4 puffs of a reliever medication per day was going to make asthma worse. And the New Scientist magazine published an article about this under the headline of "Are Asthma Drugs a Cure That Kills?" Because everywhere they looked, where the drugs had been for 10 years or more, the incidence of asthma and the death rates from asthma had gone up alarmingly. And obviously this was terrible news for the medical profession, not to mention the people taking the drugs. Then other things started to appear in the media. The Ventolin puffers are harmful. Asthma sufferers often careless with medication. Wrong approach for asthma comes under attack. Asthma sufferers are victims of indifference. New drugs may harm your lungs. Asthma inhalers ruin children's teeth. All of this bad publicity. It went on and on and on. And quite clearly something needed to be done. And so it was. What happened in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United Kingdom, was that the medical profession formed the National Asthma Campaign, the major role of which was to promote the use of preventer medications, particularly steroid preventers. And most people know when they take their steroid preventers, the asthma is under better control, and they don't take as many relievers, but we tend not to like the steroid preventers because of the side effects. So we have a tendency to undertake preventers and overly rely on relievers. And this is exacerbated in Australia by the fact that you can buy Ventolin over the counter without a prescription. You've been able to do that for over 15 years. Well, this all sounds like doom and gloom, but let me give you some good news. This can all change by correcting your breathing with the Buteyko course. And I want to assure you of the safety of learning the Buteyko method. Our Buteyko Institute of Breathing and Health policy on the use of medication is exactly the same as the medical profession. You should take preventer medication and any other prescribed pharmaceutical medication as it's been prescribed for you. And you should take reliever medication on an as required basis. But now that you're learning the Buteyko method, we invite you to try the Buteyko exercises when you get symptoms. And if Buteyko works, you won't need the reliever. If it doesn't work, you take the reliever, but you very quickly find your requirement for these drops. Just to go through the medications, on the right side with the preventers, the first 5 are what we call inhaled steroid medications, taken via a puffer. They don't do much for getting rid of symptoms. They're meant to stop the condition being worse in the future. Then we've got the oral steroid, the prednisolone, the little white tablets people have when they have severe asthma, come out of hospital, have a chest infection. Great drug for helping your breathing, but unfortunately a drug with a lot of side effects. The more well-known ones are weight gain, hair loss, stunted growth in kids, stomach ulcers, osteoporosis, easy thinning and bruising of skin, suppression of the immune system. But despite all those nasty things, still the best drug when your asthma is severe. Then we've got the non-steroid anti-inflammatory preventers. On the reliever side, well, the policy on the relievers is we should take them as required. But there is a bit of a problem because a lot of people take and have even been told to take them regardless of whether they have symptoms. People say, I take 2 puffs 4 times a day, I take reliever before preventer, I take Ventolin before I play sport. It's a bit like me saying I might have a headache in 2 hours time, I'm going to take Panadol now. So you probably wouldn't do that. So why do we take these when we don't have symptoms? Well, I know why. I did it for many years. We do it because we think we're stopping the condition from coming. And of course you will in the very short term, but again, look at the nature of these drugs and the way that they work. The adrenaline basis of them opens your airways, which is great. You've got to take them, that can save your life. But the downside is the adrenaline also increases the heart rate and makes us breathe more deeply, which is what we're saying is the initial problem in the first place. So what we've got to do to break that cycle is to correct the breathing. The first 5 there are the short-acting relievers that last for 3 or 4 hours. Atrovent and Spiriva, these are more for drying up mucus secretions, typically given to people with emphysema, bronchiectasis, chronic bronchitis. The nebulizer, the mask connected to the pump, delivering more concentrated amounts. Since 1994, we've seen the introduction of the long-acting relievers, specifically Ceravent, Forodil and Oxys. These ones will keep your airways open 8, 12, up to about 15 hours. They seem like a good idea. They were designed to help people sleep through the night. But because they keep our airways open so long and they're so strong, they cause a big increase in our breathing and our heart rate. And the dangers of them have really started to come out over the last 12 to 18 months in the scientific literature and in the media. And that included an article in the Australian newspaper in November 2004, quoting a Dr. David Graham. He's with the FDA, Food and Drug Authority in the United States. He became well known earlier that year because he was the doctor primarily responsible for the withdrawal of the arthritis drug Vioxx off the market due to the safety concerns. Dr. David Graham is now trying to get Ceravent and Seretide, which contains Ceravent, taken off the market. The reason? Turns out in the original clinical trial of the drug done by the manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline, 13 people died from taking the Ceravent. And it's now known how dangerous it is to take in isolation. So what they're saying is anyone taking Ceravent must take it in combination with an inhaled steroid. And they're recommending their own one, of course, Flixitide. But because there's people out there who still don't want to take the inhaled steroids, they can't risk people taking Ceravent on its own. So what they've now done is push the 2 drugs together. That's what Seretide is. Seretide is a combination of Ceravent and Flixitide. And there's another long-acting reliever for which similar concerns exist, Oxys, made by AstraZeneca. So what they've now done is they've combined their Oxys with their inhaled steroid Pulmicort to make Symbicort. So if anyone's on one of these combination drugs, what we ask you to do is to talk to your doctor about getting them split back to the 2 components. Because it's very important initially to stay on the preventer part, but as you change your breathing with Buteyko, you'll very quickly be able to reduce the reliever part. You can't do that when you're taking them in combination. If you can get them split the week you're doing the course, that's great. If not, any time in the 2 to 3 weeks afterwards is fine, and we can keep in contact with you on the telephone. People who have conditions like asthma and emphysema know intuitively that they're better off being upright. They find it much easier to breathe when they're struggling being upright. People will either want to sit up or they might want to lean on a table or a bench to try to help their breathing. So what I'm saying is you don't get people with asthma and emphysema saying, oh, when I get asthma I want to go to bed. I go and lie down. And I knew this intuitively as a child, and if any of you had these conditions like I did in the 60s before the drugs came out, I remember having to sleep upright on 4 or 5 pillows because if I went down too far, everything just got much worse. But what I didn't know was the reason why that was the case until I came to a Buteyko seminar. And there is a fairly simple reason why, and that is when you're upright you have most control of your breathing and you breathe smaller volumes of air. The further you go down horizontally, the more deeply you breathe. And the more deeply you breathe, the more you lose the CO2 and the more your body's going to respond by closing your airways and giving you the asthma. Now some of you are looking a bit worried and you think, if I do this course, is this guy going to have me standing up against the wardrobe all night to go to sleep? No, we're not that cruel, but we do have 3 strategies to help you to improve your sleep, which I want to share with you now so you can try these things for yourself tonight. Number 1 is sleep in the best possible position to help your breathing, which is on your left-hand side. The order of preference is the left, the right, the stomach, the back. The reason why the back is by far the worst is because when you're on your back, your mouth is much more prone to coming open and you get pressure from internal organs on your diaphragm stimulating you to breathe more deeply. The reason we prefer the left to the right is that your heart is on your left. Lying on your left stabilises your heart and causes a reduction in your breathing compared to the other positions. Your left lung is also smaller than your right, it's got 1 less lobe. Everything fits better when you lie on your left-hand side. Strategy 2 to improve your sleep is to sleep with some elevation. Remember, the more upright you are, the more you control your breathing. So if you currently sleep completely flat, we recommend a pillow. If you're on 1, you might want to go to 2. If you're on 2, you might want to taper 3 pillows. And those of you with severe sleeping disorders, it's not a bad idea if you're doing the course in the early days to prop up the top end of your bed on some books or bricks. Every bit of elevation gives you a bit more control of your breathing. And suggestion 3 to improve your sleep is to breathe through the nose. Now you all know how to clear your nose, you will at least be able to start the night breathing through it. Your nose is absolutely designed for breathing. It does 3 vital functions to help your breathing which your mouth just does not do. Your nose will filter the air because of the hairs and mucus. It will warm the air because of the supply of blood vessels. And it will humidify the air because of the mucus. When you breathe through your mouth, none of those things happen. You don't get the filtration, the warming or the humidification. And if you're constantly breathing through your mouth, if you're sleeping breathing through your mouth, or if you're speaking and mouth breathing all day, what happens is that your airways very quickly start to dry out. And the dried out airways mean that your body will try to compensate, always tries to self-correct, so it tries to lubricate your airways, and it does that by producing mucus. But once the mucus is there, if you continue to breathe through your mouth, the mucus starts to dry out, and dry mucus very quickly becomes sticky, and sticky mucus causes us to start coughing. And as soon as we start coughing, we start to breathe a much bigger volume of air, and we start to blow off the carbon dioxide. And this is actually the main reason why people with asthma often end up with it after they have a coughing fit. And it's also the reason why people with asthma often end up with asthma after being told a funny joke. It's the deep breathing associated with excessive laughter which is the problem. Now don't think if I do this course I'm never allowed to laugh again. Not at all. In fact, once you've corrected your breathing, you can laugh all day if you like, if you can become a comedian. Just in the early days you need to take it a little bit easily. And breathing is so critical, particularly at night, because in 24 hours we typically breathe between 20 and 30,000 times. And most of us like to sleep anything from 3 or 4 up to 8, 9, maybe 10 hours a night. So even without calculating it out, we take thousands of breaths when we're asleep. And there is a huge difference between taking them gently on your left, elevated through your nose, as opposed to on your back with your mouth open. Deep breathing is very, very hard work. Some of you people might be doing the breathing during the night for hard physical exercise. So no wonder you're so exhausted in the morning. But the problem is you're not going anywhere. And the reason why physical exercise is so good for us, and it's something we do talk about in a later component of the course, is that we get carbon dioxide released from our muscles because of the movement. But if you're lying in bed and breathing deeply during your sleep, that doesn't happen. It can be extremely damaging for our health. So in summary, being on your left, being elevated, and at least starting the night breathing through the nose are the key things to improving the sleep. More and more people are getting diagnosed with a condition called sleep apnea. And apnea means pause or stop. So sleep apnea is a condition where you actually stop breathing in your sleep. Now it often starts with a snoring problem. And the Buteyko view on snoring is that snoring is another reaction of the body to try to reduce your breathing, to restrict it, and to hold on to carbon dioxide. But people with snoring often very quickly start to develop apnea, these periods when the breathing actually stops. So apnea means pause or stop. And usually when someone first has sleep apnea, it's just a very slight stopping and starting of the breathing, and the person themselves is not really aware of it. It's often their partner or someone else in the house who becomes aware of the disturbed breathing pattern. But if it's not dealt with, what generally happens is that these apneas tend to get longer and longer and longer. And we've had people on the Buteyko courses who've shown us their sleep studies where they've had apneas of up to 2, sometimes even 3 minutes. And there's a couple of major problems there. The more apneas you're getting and the longer they are, the greater the chances of having something like a stroke or a heart attack. And as we know, thousands of people in Australia die every year from these things, and it's greatly increased in likelihood by having sleep apnea. And it's responsible for more deaths in Australia than what asthma is, but it still doesn't get anywhere near the publicity that it deserves. And the other problem, of course, is that if you've held your breath in your sleep for any period of time, 10, 20, 30, 40 seconds, let alone a minute or two, when you do resume breathing, the breath is going to be extremely deep. So what happens is that the person wakes up. That's why you get this terrible cycle of sleeping, waking, sleeping, waking, sleeping, waking, and you might have been in bed for 8 or 9 hours, but you get up in the morning and you feel like you've slept for about an hour and a half. And people with sleep apnea are constantly tired throughout the day. They struggle to concentrate in the morning. They end up eating their lunch and they just feel like collapsing and going to sleep. They struggle throughout the afternoon. Quite often they can't drive a car, or they're at great risk when they do because of the fact that they often fall asleep. And then they get through the day and they eat an evening meal, they sit in an armchair and bang, they just go straight to sleep. Well, the key for fixing sleep apnea is to correct the breathing pattern. And the first thing we've got to do is change the way that we breathe during the daytime in order to change the way that we breathe in the night time. And the way that the medical profession currently deals with sleep apnea is usually one of two things. Either people have an operation for obstructive sleep apnea, which means the removal of part of the soft palate, or the most common way at the moment is to put people on what's called a CPAP machine. A lot of you can't probably see this very well, but this happy couple in bed here are both using their CPAP masks. It's a mask which is connected to a pump which blows air on the face to stimulate you to keep breathing. And usually when people first go on the CPAP machine, if they can comply, and we know the compliance rate is very, very low, it can be anything from about 15 to 40% depending on what you read. If they are able to comply with it, they normally do get improvements initially. But the problem with this from the Buteyko perspective, it's a little bit like someone with asthma taking Ventolin or using nebulizers. All you're doing is dealing with the symptoms, you're not dealing with the fundamental cause. The method that you're using to stop the symptoms is actually in the long term making you breathe more deeply, because your body's trying to stop your breathing because you're breathing too much. But you use a treatment which keeps you breathing. So it's going to mask the apnea by stopping those symptoms, but it increases your hyperventilation and will cause other problems. And people with sleep apnea often have problems with their blood pressure, or problems with their heart, or problems with an increase in coughing or poor concentration, all related to the fact that their CO2 level is lowering because of the overbreathing. So just to summarise the Buteyko view on sleep apnea, what we're saying is that the main cause of the sleep apnea is the fact that you're overbreathing in the first place, hyperventilating, HV. Hyperventilation, as we've explained, leads to a lowering of the level of carbon dioxide in the lungs. And because carbon dioxide is acidic, lower levels of carbon dioxide cause an increase of the pH of the blood. You go into what's called respiratory alkalosis. And the result of that, because of the Bohr effect, is a tightening of the bond between the oxygen and the haemoglobin in the blood. So you end up with a lack of oxygen at the cellular level. You go into hypoxia. And the body has to compensate, and it does that by stopping the breathing completely with the apnea. And as I said before, we've had a lot of people who've been able to avoid going on the machines, having the obstructive sleep apnea, and a lot of people who've been able to come off the CPAP machine. But if you're on the CPAP machine, it's not just a matter of coming here and throwing it away. We have to treat the CPAP machine like a prescribed medication. And what has to happen is we have to improve your breathing to a certain extent, and then start to have some periods, short periods of either observed sleep, or maybe setting up a tape recorder for a period of time, 20, 30, 40 minutes, waking yourself and then playing it back and see what starts to happen. And as your apneas decrease in duration and severity, you increase the amount of time without the machine. So you are able, in many, many cases, to actually wean yourself off the machine. But as I said, if you've been on it for many, many years, like 5, 10, 15 or even 20 years, which some people have, you don't just suddenly have to stop it like that. You have to wean yourself off it. And what we're going to start to do in the Buteyko course from tomorrow when we introduce the exercises is actually measure your particular level of carbon dioxide. We're not going to use any equipment for that. We use breathing techniques that Buteyko has developed. So to summarise what I've been saying about sleep apnea, we have this diagram on the board, and as I said, this is contained in an article which you're welcome to take a copy of later on. The Buteyko view on sleep apnea is that the main cause of the sleep apnea is the overbreathing or hyperventilation, HV as it's known, overbreathing. Hyperventilation, as we've described, leads to a loss of carbon dioxide from your lungs, so the CO2 level goes down. And when that happens, because carbon dioxide is acidic, you see a resultant increase in the pH of your blood. You go into what's called respiratory alkalosis. And that causes a tightening of the bond between the oxygen and the haemoglobin in your blood due to the Bohr effect. So you end up with a lack of oxygen. You go into hypoxia. And the body has to self-correct, and it does that by stopping the breathing and giving you the apnea. But as we've explained, when you stop breathing, external respiration stops, but internal respiration increases. So the carbon dioxide level rises. This normalises the pH of the blood, and because of the Bohr effect, the bond will break and the oxygen gets released and goes to the cells and tissues, so the oxygen level goes back up. But what this does is cause us to start over-breathing again, so we go back into hyperventilation and the whole process continues. So what we have to do to stop the apneas occurring is to stop the fundamental problem, which is the hyperventilation which is occurring in the first place. So if we want to stop the cycle and stop the apneas, what we've got to do is fix the fundamental problem, which is the hyperventilation. So what we need to do at first is to change the way that we breathe during the daytime, increase our tolerance to carbon dioxide, and we very quickly find we start to get a decrease in both the duration and the frequency of the apneas. Now obviously if you're not on a CPAP machine or you haven't had an operation, it's easier. If you are on a CPAP machine, we can't just suddenly throw that away and stop using it. We treat the CPAP machine like we treat a prescribed preventer medication. You have to stay on it initially, but what we've got to do is improve your breathing and improve your tolerance to carbon dioxide. And we start to measure that in the course right from tomorrow's session. Not using equipment, but using breathing techniques that Buteyko has developed, which give a very good estimation of your alveolar carbon dioxide level. Then when you reach certain standards, what we do is if you're on the CPAP machine, we get you to have periods, short periods of either observed sleep to see what's happening with the frequency and duration of the apneas, or if you can't arrange that, you can rig up a tape recorder for 30, 40 minutes or an hour and then play it back and then see what happens. So the idea is you gradually increase the amount of time you sleep without the machine as your breathing starts to improve. And we've been able to help many, many people actually come off the CPAP machines. And what people notice right from the start is that their daytime energy levels start to improve. The other conditions that we typically teach the Buteyko method for are emphysema. As a lot of you would know, people with emphysema actually have some damage to the lung tissue, but they invariably get given the asthma medications. We're not claiming to reverse that damage, but what we can do is greatly reduce the person's reliance on reliever medication, in most cases get them off relievers but maintained on preventers. And also they very quickly notice an increase in their stamina and mobility, because people with emphysema invariably get out of breath very, very quickly, and they find that their ability to do even simple things like walk out to the letterbox is greatly diminished. But we've had some significant turnarounds, even in people who've been very severe, people on multiple nebulizers per day and taking oxygen for periods of time during the day. Well, eventually you'll be able to, but if you've been using the machine every day for 15 years, you don't just suddenly throw it away, because it takes time to change your breathing.
So it's just training yourself.
Yeah.
Before you actually do it.
Absolutely, yeah. But like this, I'm sure there's people here who have a CPAP machine who might have had it for less than 2 years and occasionally they sleep without it. If that's the case, when they start the Buteyko course, they can sleep without it. But there might be someone else who's never slept without it for 10 years or something. In that case, you can't just toss it away. It's like the medications. It's all got to be done very safely, very scientifically and very systematically.
Does this method help during the night a busy brain? You mentally...
Yeah, because one of the problems is you sleep much better when you're relaxed, and you're much more relaxed when your heart rate is down and when your carbon dioxide level is up, and that relaxes everything, including your mind. Because if you've got thoughts racing around in your mind, that increases your anxiety, and then your heart rate increases, and you breathe more and you get more restless and you can't sleep. And also, as I mentioned, to increase sports performance. There's 3 reasonably famous people who've done very well. The big guy here is Con Burrell. He was a New Zealand All Black in the mid to late 1980s. He lost his place in the All Blacks because of his chronic asthma. At that stage he was on 20 milligrams of prednisolone and 4 nebulizers per day. Subsequently did the Buteyko course, got off all his drugs and won his place back in the All Blacks. And he was obviously delighted with that, and he did a huge amount of publicity for Buteyko in New Zealand. This guy is Raman Anderson. He won a bronze medal for Australia in the 1992 Olympics in the K4 kayak. 2 years after that, his chronic fatigue syndrome was so bad that he was not able to train at all, bedridden. Subsequently did the Buteyko course, got back into full training, went to the 96 Olympics for Australia, came 5th. No one ever remembers him because he didn't win a medal, but a fantastic effort after having chronic fatigue. And this guy is Craig Riddington, an Ironman based in Sydney. He did the Buteyko course, he got off all his asthma drugs and greatly improved his performance. He was featured on an SBS documentary, the TV program Second Opinion. And it's an interesting one. I've actually got it on tape. We actually look at some of the TV documentaries and current affairs segments just to look at some case studies of people who'd learnt Buteyko and also to back up and reinforce some of the things that we're learning in the course. And the presenter of the show, when Craig Riddington was involved, he had asthma himself and he ended up doing the Buteyko course also, and he was able to report on his improvement at the end. So if you're interested in sports performance, it's very good news. What you find is that after you've corrected your breathing with Buteyko, you're able to do a lot more on a lot less breath, and that means you've got a lot more in reserve. This is how you're able to improve your performance in time. And you also find if you're doing any endurance work like long distance running or a lot of bike riding or swimming, people often find after they do something very strenuous that they're very sore in their muscles the next day. They've got this muscle fatigue. And what you find once you've corrected your breathing with Buteyko and you're able to do endurance sports with your mouth closed, you just don't get that soreness. And the reason is that if you're over-breathing, if you're mouth-breathing under duress in exercise, remember you're getting this tightening of the bond between the oxygen and the haemoglobin, you have a very high energy demand but you can't meet it. So in order to meet that extra demand, what happens is that your body will break down glycogen. But once you're breathing correctly with Buteyko and you're getting maximum oxygenation from your blood, there's no need for the body to break down the glycogen, so you don't get that fatigue and you find that your performance increases greatly. The Buteyko course, as we mentioned, the Buteyko course is 5 sessions of 90 minutes, including one of these introductions. We're going to be here all week, both from 4:30 to 6 and from 7 till 8:30. Everybody who does the Buteyko course is welcome to have someone with them to provide support. So like a partner or a relative. Under 18s must be accompanied by an adult. And there's no charge for the supporting person, only the one actually doing the course. If there is a second or third family member who needs to do the Buteyko course, then it's half price for a second or third family member. We can teach Buteyko successfully to anyone from 3 years upwards. There is no upper limit. 92 is the oldest person I've had do the Buteyko course. And it's not that it doesn't work for children under 3, it's just that we can't guarantee the concentration and participation. But if there are parents of children under 3 who do have respiratory problems, we're quite happy for them just to sit through the course on a donation basis, and we've had several times now where that's happened. And a couple of times they've been able to report back to us that with everything that they'd learned in here, watching other people, understanding the theory, and then when their children start to have asthma attacks, they've been able to totally reverse them by closing their mouths. But they said, how could you possibly attempt to do that if you didn't understand this and hadn't seen what happens? Because when your child is struggling for breath, you think that's the worst thing that you can possibly do. And this is one of the tragedies of Australia's asthma epidemic, and it's one of the reasons why the Buteyko method has been a bit controversial. Because the current system of treating things doesn't really seem to work very well. Because you don't hear of people who got asthma, went to the doctor, and then 5 years later they don't have asthma, they don't take drugs. Most people have worse asthma and take more drugs than they did when they started out. And you very rarely hear of people who get diagnosed with sleep apnea, who go on CPAP machines, and then one day they've got no more sleep apnea, they give them the machine back and they don't have any problems. All we're doing is treating symptoms. Most of us just sign up for life and end up using, cranking the machine up or taking more medication. And it's also the reason why a lot of people who do the Buteyko course with us, by the end of the course they get very angry. Not angry at the practitioners, but angry to think that this method's been around in Australia since 1990 and they didn't hear about it until they saw something in a local paper a week or 2 ago. But it's not really anyone's fault. It all comes back to the way the method was introduced into the country. Remember, its introduction's been very different. And we'd encourage you to share the information that we give you with your doctors. And some of your doctors have still probably never heard of it. Some of them might. We know people are now often referred by their doctors, but a lot of them just don't know much about it because they don't even get time to read all the medical journals. Most of the technical information they get is what gets thrust under their nose from pharmaceutical representatives. But after we do the course, or even before we do it in some cases, or certainly during it, we come to the conclusion that the way that conditions like asthma and sleep apnea are currently being managed is at the very best maintaining the condition, but in most cases, unfortunately, is making it worse. How many people go on a CPAP machine and then stop their sleep apnea and no longer need the machine? How many people get put on asthma drugs and 5 years later don't take any drugs and don't have worse asthma? Most of us just sign up for life and things continue to get worse. And again, that's one of the reasons why Buteyko method has been very, very controversial, because it actually fixes the problem. It took nearly 5 years to get the first clinical trial of the Buteyko method in Australia, and it took 4 years after that for the results to be published in the Australian Medical Journal, December 1998. When you do the Buteyko course, we give you a kit of information, including a set of notes. The most important thing in here, though, is the exercise sheet, where you're going to be recording the results for the various exercises and techniques that you learn, and also for the monitoring of your pulse. And the right-hand column is where you make notes about your change in physical condition, sleeping pattern and so on, and also change in medication intake. The sets of exercises, well, they take you about 12 minutes to do per set, and by the end of the course it'll be taking you a total of about an hour or just over an hour per day. So it's not an hour straight through, it's in these blocks of about 12 minutes. And we will encourage you to continue doing those exercises for a minimum period of a month, or until you've always got your carbon dioxide level at least the 5.5% mark. And we're going to start measuring your carbon dioxide levels on Saturday, not using any equipment but using breathing techniques that Buteyko has developed. The course fee also includes any follow-up that you require, so when we do further courses you will be invited to attend. We also give you 24-hour telephone contact when you do the Buteyko course. And let's just say that you did enrol this week and you did 3 days and then something happened in your life or whatever and you had to go away or you couldn't do it, then you can come back and do part or the whole of the course again if you want to. There's only ever one charge for Buteyko. And how many people here did not receive information from us in the post? A few did, a few didn't. Maybe if you just take one and just pass them along if you don't mind. What we've got here is a bit of a kit of information. The first document, the main document, is the newsletter. This is a 6-page document. A lot of the things that we've spoken about today, the history, the theory, the safety aspects, the medication, information about clinical trials, it's all included there in the newsletter. On the front bottom right, some of you may recognise Peter Thompson, the film critic from Channel 9's Sunday program. He did the Buteyko course about 9 years ago and got great results. And 2 years ago we had the second International Buteyko Conference in Melbourne. Most of the articles on this board here were related to the conference in July-August 2002. And part of that conference was an event at Dallas Brooks Hall, which is a big convention centre in central Melbourne, where we invited everyone in Victoria that we knew who'd learnt the Buteyko method to come along. And Peter Thompson came down from Sydney and compared the event. And on the second page there you'll see a lot of small photographs down the bottom of people holding a microphone. These are people who took the roving microphone and stood up and told their stories of improvement with the Buteyko method. It was a very, very inspiring occasion. Also inside here we have a one-page sheet on the application of the Buteyko method to snoring and sleep apnea. Inside the newsletter itself there's a lot of information about asthma and other respiratory conditions. And the other document in here is the course enrolment form. Also on the back there you'll see an article about the visit to New York from a couple of years ago that I spoke about. Also on the back is a chronology of events surrounding the Buteyko method. We suggest you do the exercises for a minimum period of a month. Some people won't need to do them that long. Some people will need to do them for a few months. But the good thing is you notice improvements every step along the way. It's not a matter of I've got to do this for a month and then I'm better. You're going to notice within 24, 48 hours that things are getting better. People have the option of coming back to, to do the course, all or part of the course again if they want to. Yeah. But it's ironic. It's often the people who are the sickest who get the best results. Because if you've been suffering, if you're using a machine, if you've been going to hospital, if you can't work, you can't go to school, or can't play sport, then you've got huge motivation. Whereas if your condition is mild and you take one puff of Ventolin a month or you occasionally snore, you think, why should I bother to do this and pay money and attend a course? But if your quality of life is affected, you've got huge motivation. But really, it's a method of prevention. And what we're trying to do through our institute is get this to kids when they first have problems when they're 3 or 4 or 5 years old, to stop them going down the path that obviously so many of us in this room have had to go down. But human nature is most of us don't do something until the problem is very severe. Well, look, thank you very much for your attention. Just for our planning purposes, how many people are interested? You don't have to commit yourself now, but how many people are interested in the 4:30 sessions this week? And how many people for the 7 o'clock sessions? Because we will be running both, okay? And you can switch during the week if you have commitments. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, and we look forward to working with several of you to help you to improve your health. Thank you. To make it worthwhile, you'd need to attend at least 3 of the 4 days. But if it was only one that you were missing, because like I said, I'm going to be staying here, so I'm sure we can work something else out.
Do it again around the region, somewhere else.
No.
Do you have many people that don't persevere with it, that give up?
Well,
You don't know?
no. Well, if you see the enrolment form, we give people a money back guarantee. And the instance of that happening is less than 1 in 100. And the only time it happens, usually it's because, say you come along and you go home and tell someone there how great it is and try to get them to do it, but if they don't want to do the exercise, they're not going to get better. And the irony of it is it's often the people who are the most severe who get the best results, because the more you put into this, the more you get out of it. And if you're faced with using a machine for the rest of your life, having disturbed sleep, taking drugs, going to hospital, you can't play sport, you can't go out, you're going to have a very, very high motivation to do very well with the method. One guy did the course with me a couple of months ago, and at the end he said the reason he did the course, he said he actually was one of the few people who could comply with the CPAP, and he thought it was okay. But he said his grandchildren came to stay with him. They came in the morning and he was wearing this thing and they freaked out. They thought he was a man from Mars or something. And that's when he decided to get off it. After watching hundreds of people breathe deeply prior to death, he first addressed his own breathing, and he was able to correct his breathing and he normalised his blood pressure. And for the last 50 years of his life, he had normal blood pressure after having high blood pressure in his mid to late 20s. That's one of the reasons why we need all this information about your particular symptoms and conditions and medications, because the reason why it works, by the way, there's several roles of carbon dioxide within the body, and the main one that I've focused on today is to facilitate the release of oxygen from haemoglobin in your blood. But carbon dioxide is also a smooth muscle relaxant or smooth muscle dilator. And you've got smooth muscle wrapped around your airways. So as you start to change your breathing and elevate the CO2 level, the smooth muscle relaxes and the airways open. This is how people with asthma and emphysema get relief. But you've also got smooth muscle in a lot of other places in your body, including your blood vessels. So as the carbon dioxide level increases, the smooth muscle relaxes and the blood pressure will start to decrease. So if you're on antihypertensive medications, we recommend that you get your blood pressure monitored within a week of finishing the Buteyko course, because you'll likely get a pleasant surprise. You'll find that it will be improving, which will mean that you won't need as much medication, so that needs to be readjusted. Because if you don't get it readjusted, you'll end up on too much medication. You can have side effects as a result of that. We explain all that in the course, so the answer is yes.